The morning sun streamed through the airport terminal's massive windows as Rose Chen adjusted her navy blue uniform scarf in the crew room mirror. After 15 years as a flight attendant with Atlantic Airways, she had her pre-flight routine down to a science. A quick check of her appearance, a swift glance at her watch, and she was ready for another day in the skies. "Good morning, everyone," she called out cheerfully to her fellow crew members, who were gathering their belongings for the 6-hour flight from New York to Los Angeles. The familiar buzz of airport announcements and rolling suitcases filled the air as Rose reviewed her flight manifest. First class was fully booked today, mostly the usual mix of business executives and frequent flyers she'd grown accustomed to serving. As she walked through the terminal, Rose couldn't help but feel proud of her career. She'd worked her way up from domestic short hauls to international flights, and now she was the lead flight attendant on one of the airline's premium routes. Her colleagues often joked that she could spot a passenger in the wrong seat from a mile away. Coffee first, she reminded herself, stopping at the crew's favorite airport cafe. The barista already knew her order: a double-shot espresso with a splash of almond milk. "Can't handle those cross-country flights without my morning fuel," she said with a warm smile, dropping her usual tip in the jar. At the gate, Rose began her pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. She straightened the magazines in their pockets, made sure the blankets were perfectly folded, and double-checked the passenger list. Her attention to detail had earned her multiple Staff Excellence Awards, and she took genuine pride in making sure everything was perfect for her passengers. "Weather looks clear all the way to La," one of her coworkers mentioned while stocking the galley. "Should be an easy flight." Rose nodded, but something felt different about today. Maybe it was the extra spring in her step from her recent promotion to senior cabin crew trainer, or perhaps it was just the perfect autumn weather. Either way, she had no idea that this routine flight would completely change her perspective on everything she thought she knew about her job. As pre-boarding began, Rose positioned herself at the aircraft door, greeting each first-class passenger with her signature welcoming smile. She prided herself on remembering regular travelers and their preferences, like Mr. Thompson, who always requested an extra pillow, or Mrs. Patel, who preferred her tea with just a hint of honey. "Everything needs to be perfect," she whispered to herself, straightening a slightly crooked seatbelt. First class was her domain, and she ran it with the precision of a 5-star hotel manager. Her colleagues sometimes teased her about being too perfectionist, but Rose knew that attention to detail was what set great service apart from merely good service. Little did Rose know that in just a few minutes, her perfectly organized world would be turned upside down by an interaction that would make her question everything about how she did her job. As she finished her preliminary checks, the final first-class passengers began to board, and with them would come a moment that would change not just her day, but her entire approach to her profession. The familiar pre-flight energy filled the cabin as passengers settled in, storing their bags and arranging their personal items. Rose moved through the aisle with practiced grace, offering assistance where needed and ensuring everything was running smoothly. She had no idea that her next interaction would spark a chain of events that would make this seemingly ordinary flight anything but routine. As the final group of passengers made their way down the aisle, Rose noticed a young man in a casual black t-shirt and jeans settling into seat 2A in first class. He was looking through his phone, completely at ease, but something about his presence made her pause. She'd have memorized most of the regular first-class passengers on this route, and he wasn't one of them. "It's probably nothing," she thought to herself, but protocol is protocol. She'd dealt with passengers in the wrong section before, and it was always easier to handle these situations early. Smoothing her uniform, she approached with her practiced smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "May I see your boarding pass?" The man looked up from his phone, and Rose noticed several other passengers turning to watch the interaction. The young man's expression remained neutral as he reached not for a boarding pass, but for something else in his back pocket. "Actually," he said calmly, Pulling out an airline ID, "I'm Captain David Lee. I'll be flying this aircraft today." He held up his credentials, which clearly showed his position as one of the airline's senior pilots. Rose felt the color drain from her face as nearby passengers exchanged glances. The credentials were legitimate. She was looking at the commander of her aircraft, the person responsible for safely flying them across the country. And she had just questioned his right to be in first class. I apologize, Captain," she stammered, her usual professional composure cracking slightly. "I was just following standard procedure for—" Her voice trailed off as she realized how hollow her explanation sounded. Captain Lee tucked his ID back into his pocket. "No worries," he said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're doing your job. Though I have to wonder, did you check everyone else's boarding pass in first class today?" The question hung in the air. Rose knew she hadn't. She'd only approached him, and they both knew why. The realization made her stomach twist uncomfortably. A few nearby passengers shifted awkwardly in their seats, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or magazines. "I need to complete the pre-flight checks," Rose said quietly, retreating to the galley. Her hands shook slightly as she arranged the drink cart. In 15 years of flying, she'd never felt so embarrassed or so wrong. Her fellow flight attendant, Me, noticed her distress. "Everything okay?" she whispered, helping to stock the ice bins. Rose just shook her head slightly, unable to find the words to explain what had just happened. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of safety demonstrations and final preparations. Rose moved through her duties mechanically, her mind replaying the interaction over and over. She could hear occasional whispers from passengers who had witnessed the scene, making her cheeks burn with shame. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Rose caught a glimpse of Captain Lee in his uniform, now heading to the cockpit. He walked with confidence, greeting other crew members warmly, showing no sign that the earlier interaction had affected him. But Rose noticed something else too. The way some passengers did a double take, the subtle surprised looks that she might have missed before. The weight of what she'd done began to sink in. This wasn't just about one awkward interaction. It was about patterns and assumptions she'd never questioned before. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, Rose had no idea that her day was about to become even more challenging. What she didn't know was that in just a few hours, she would receive a call to the cockpit that would turn this uncomfortable situation into something completely unexpected. For now, though, she focused on her duties, trying to ignore the knowing looks from passengers who had witnessed her mistake, unaware that this flight would change her perspective forever. The first hour of the flight passed painfully slowly for Rose. Every time she walked through first class, she felt the weight of curious glances from passengers who had witnessed her interaction with Captain Lee. The usual comfort she found in her routine tasks felt hollow today, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. During the meal service, Rose overheard snippets of conversation that made her stomach churn. "Can you believe what happened during boarding?" One passenger whispered to another. "I've never seen anything like it." She pretended not to hear, focusing instead on perfectly placing each plate on the fold-out tables. In the galley, her colleague Mai tried to help. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said softly while preparing the drink cart. "Maybe you could try talking to him after we land." Rose shook her head, arranging wine glasses with trembling hands. "What would I even say? Sorry, I assumed you didn't belong in first class because of how you look." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. She had always prided herself on being professional and fair, but today's events had shattered that self-image. The story of what happened had already spread through the cabin crew like wildfire. During her brief break, Rose noticed how some of her colleagues seemed to avoid eye contact, while others gave her looks that mixed pity with disappointment. Chen, another flight attendant, pulled her aside near the rear galley. "You know," he said quietly, "my brother's a surgeon, and people always mistake him for a nurse or technician. It happens so often, He doesn't even react anymore." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But that doesn't make it right." Rose felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had always thought of herself as open-minded. After all, she worked with people from all over the world. But now, memories of past interactions started flooding back. Subtle assumptions she'd made, quick judgments based on appearances. The intercom crackled to life. "Attention passengers, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting some light turbulence ahead, so I've turned on the seatbelt sign as a precaution. Cabin crew, please prepare the cabin." Captain Lee's voice was steady and professional. No hint of the earlier incident in his tone. Rose began her safety checks, securing loose items and reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. As she worked, she noticed a young girl watching the cockpit door with wide-eyed admiration. "Is it true the pilot flies the whole plane by himself?" the girl asked when Rose passed by. Before Rose could answer, the girl's mother added, "She was so excited when she saw Captain Lee during boarding. She wants to be a pilot too." The impact of her earlier actions hit Rose with new force. She wasn't just questioning one person's right to be in first class. She was perpetuating the kind of thinking that might make this little girl doubt her own dreams someday. As the turbulence began to rock the plane gently, Rose held onto the overhead bins for support. The physical unsteadiness matched her emotional state perfectly. She knew she needed to do something to address what had happened, but the thought of facing Captain Lee again made her heart race. What she didn't realize was that fate would soon force that confrontation in a way she never expected. As the plane continued its journey westward, she had no idea that in less than an hour, she would receive a call to the cockpit that would turn this uncomfortable situation into something entirely different. For now, though, she continued her duties, each step down the aisle feeling heavier than the last. The weight of her actions, the whispered conversations, and her own shattered self-image created a tension that seemed to grow with every passing minute. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a much bigger journey. 3 hours into the flight, Rose was restocking coffee cups in the back galley when the intercom buzzed. "Flight attendant Rose to the cockpit, please." Her heart skipped a beat as Captain Lee's voice echoed through the plane. Several passengers looked up from their screens, clearly remembering the earlier incident. "I can cover for you," May offered, noticing Rose's pale face. But they both knew this was something Rose had to handle herself. She took a deep breath, straightened her uniform, and began the long walk to the front of the plane. Each step felt like an eternity. First-class passengers watched as she passed, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. The young girl, who wanted to be a pilot, gave her a small wave, making Rose's chest tighten even more. Standing before the cockpit door, Rose's hand trembled slightly as she pressed the call button. The door buzzed open, and she stepped into the small space that suddenly felt far too confined. Captain Lee sat in the left seat, his eyes focused on the instruments in front of him. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to the jump seat behind the co-pilot, who was taking a short break. Through the cockpit windows, Rose could see nothing but endless blue sky and white clouds, a view that usually brought her peace, but now felt overwhelming. "I assume you know why I called you here," Captain Lee began, his voice calm and measured. Rose braced herself for the reprimand she felt she deserved, but what came next surprised her completely. "Would you like to hear about my first day at flight school?" he asked, adjusting a dial on the control panel. The question caught Rose off guard. This wasn't the conversation she had expected. "I walked into that classroom, and out of 50 students, I was the only one who looked like me," he continued, his eyes still on the horizon. The instructor asked if I was in the right room. Said pilot training was down the hall. He smiled slightly at the memory, but Rose could see the hurt behind it. "I've been flying for 15 years now," he said, finally turning to look at her. "And do you know how many times I've been questioned about belonging somewhere in my own airline? I've lost count." Rose felt tears welling up in her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered, the words feeling completely inadequate. I never meant to. I know, Captain Lee interrupted gently. That's actually why I called you here. Because you're not the first, and you probably won't be the last. But you're one of the few who seems to really care about making it right. He reached into his flight bag and pulled out a worn photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself standing proudly in front of a small training aircraft. This was my first solo flight, he explained. My instructor told me that day that being a pilot isn't just about flying the plane. It's about helping others reach new heights too. Rose looked at the photo, seeing the same determination in young Captain Lee's eyes that she'd witnessed during their confrontation earlier. The cockpit fell quiet except for the gentle hum of the engines. I have a proposition for you, he said finally. Instead of just feeling bad about what happened, how about we work together to make sure it happens less often? The suggestion hung in the air between them, offering something Rose hadn't expected, a chance to learn and grow from her mistake. As the plane cruised at 36,000 feet, Rose realized this conversation wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. What she didn't know yet was how this moment would spark changes that would ripple through the entire airline, touching lives far beyond this single flight. Still seated in the cockpit, Rose listened intently as Captain Lee shared more of his journey. The usual background noise of engines and radio communications seemed to fade away as his story unfolded. I knew I wanted to be a pilot since I was 6, he said, his eyes brightening with a memory. My grandfather took me to the airport every Sunday just to watch planes take off. He couldn't afford to buy me toy planes, so he taught me to make paper ones instead. He paused to check their heading, making a slight adjustment. When I got the scholarship to flight school, my whole family celebrated. We didn't have much, but my parents had always taught me that education could open any door. Rose found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in his words. This wasn't just her captain speaking anymore. This was someone sharing pieces of their life that made them who they were. First day of training, he continued, I showed up an hour early. Pressed uniform, polished shoes. I thought if I worked twice as hard, proved myself twice as much, people would see past. He gestured to himself, letting the sentence hang unfinished. But you became one of the youngest captains in the airline's history, Rose said softly, remembering bits of conversation she'd overheard in crew briefings. Captain Lee nodded. That's the thing about assumptions. They can make you work harder to prove them wrong, but they never stop hurting. He reached for his coffee cup, taking a thoughtful sip. You know what really got me through? My first flight instructor, Captain Wilson. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, and he adjusted the controls smoothly before continuing. He saw how other students treated me, how some instructors did too. But instead of letting it slide, he spoke up. Every single time. Said silence only makes things worse. Rose thought about all the times she'd stayed quiet when she should have spoken up. About all the little moments she'd witnessed but chosen to ignore. The weight of those silences felt heavy now. One day, Captain Lee said, checking their altitude, I was ready to quit. Another student had suggested I'd only gotten in because of quotas. He smiled slightly. Captain Wilson took me up that day, let me fly through some pretty challenging weather. When we landed, he said, a plane doesn't care what color your skin is or where you come from. It cares if you can fly it. Through the cockpit window, Rose watched as they passed through a layer of clouds, emerging into clear blue sky. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. That's why I called you up here, he said, turning to face her fully for the first time. Because like Captain Wilson, I believe change happens one person at a time. One conversation at a time. The co-pilot would be returning soon, but Captain Lee had one more thing to share. He pulled out his phone, showing Rose a photo of a classroom full of young, diverse faces. I teach at the Flight Academy on weekends, he explained. Every single one of these students has a story about being told they don't belong. But they're still here, still dreaming. Rose felt something shift inside her as she looked at those hopeful faces. She saw determination in their eyes, the same kind she'd seen in the young girl in first class who dreamed of becoming a pilot. "So," Captain Lee said, putting his phone away, ready to be part of the change. Before Rose could answer, the cockpit door opened as the co-pilot returned. But something had fundamentally shifted in those few minutes. She had walked in expecting a reprimand, but was leaving with something far more valuable: a new perspective and a chance to make a real difference. Just as Rose left the cockpit, her mind still processing everything Captain Lee had shared, the plane shuddered. The clear blue skies they'd been flying through suddenly darkened with angry storm clouds. The seat belt sign chimed on immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Lee's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "We're approaching an area of turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin." Rose sprung into action, her training taking over. She moved quickly through the cabin, checking seat belts and securing loose items. The plane jolted again, stronger this time, causing a few passengers to gasp. "It's just a rough patch," she reassured an anxious passenger, helping him secure his laptop. "Captain Lee is one of our most experienced pilots." The words came naturally now, filled with genuine confidence rather than just professional courtesy. In the galley, Mai struggled to secure a drink cart that had started rolling. Rose rushed to help, both of them bracing against another wave of turbulence. "You seem different," Mai observed as they worked together. "What happened in the cockpit?" Before Rose could answer, the plane dropped suddenly, like an elevator falling a few floors. Drinks rattled in the galley. A child started crying somewhere in the cabin. But through it all, Rose could feel the steady hand of experience in how the plane was being handled. Through the small galley window, she could see the wing flexing as it fought the rough air. Captain Lee's voice came through again, steady as ever. "Cabin crew, please take your seats. We'll be in this weather for about 15 minutes. As Rose buckled into her jump seat, she thought about what Captain Lee had said about flying through challenging weather with his instructor. Now she was experiencing firsthand how skill and experience transcended all superficial differences. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. The plane continued to bounce and sway, but Rose noticed something remarkable. While passengers looked worried, they seemed to draw comfort from the calm, professional updates Captain Lee provided every few minutes. "Note how he keeps everyone informed," she thought. "No one's panicking because he's not letting them imagine the worst." It was another lesson in leadership, delivered in the middle of a storm. Finally, the plane broke through into smoother air. Sunlight streamed through the windows again, and a collective sigh of relief went through the cabin. As soon as the seat belt sign switched off, Rose was up, checking on passengers and helping restore order to the cabin. "That was quite a ride," an elderly passenger said as Rose helped him with his spilled water. "But I felt safe the whole time. That pilot really knows what he's doing." "Yes, he does," Rose replied, feeling a deep sense of shame about her earlier assumptions. Here was a man who had just guided over 200 people safely through a storm, and she had questioned his right to sit in first class. As she moved through the cabin, Rose overheard snippets of conversation. Passengers who had witnessed her earlier confrontation with Captain Lee were now praising his handling of the turbulence. The irony wasn't lost on her. In the galley, while cleaning up displaced items, Rose found herself sharing Captain Lee's story with May and the other flight attendants. About his grandfather and the paper planes, about his fight to be accepted in flight school, about teaching weekend classes to inspire the next generation. "You know," one of the younger flight attendants said, "my sister wants to be a pilot, but people keep telling her it's not for girls." Rose looked at her colleague with new eyes, suddenly seeing how assumptions and prejudices affected everyone differently. The turbulence had done more than just shake up the flight. It had shaken loose old ways of thinking. As they prepared for landing, Rose realized that sometimes the roughest patches lead to the clearest skies. The days following that memorable flight changed how Rose saw everything around her. It started the very next morning at the airport, where she found herself noticing things she'd somehow missed for 15 years. She watched as a security guard asked a young woman in a pilot's uniform for extra ID verification, while other pilots walked through unchallenged. At the coffee shop, she saw how the barista automatically handed the receipt to a man in a suit rather than his female colleague who'd actually paid for the order. During her pre-flight briefing, Rose caught herself really looking at her crew for the first time. They were a rainbow of backgrounds and experiences, yet somehow she'd never truly thought about their individual journeys to get here. "Hey, can I ask you something?" she said to her colleague Lynn during their break. "Have you ever felt different working here?" The question felt clumsy, but she had to start somewhere. Lynn's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the question. "Every day," she said quietly. "Passengers sometimes speak slower to me, assuming I won't understand. Some even request a different flight attendant, though they never say exactly why." Rose felt her chest tighten. How had she never noticed? Or had she noticed but chosen not to see? Later that week, while checking in for her flight, she overheard a conversation that made her stop in her tracks. A young maintenance engineer was explaining something to a senior staff member, who kept interrupting her and suggesting they wait for one of the guys to confirm. The engineer kept her cool, patiently explaining that she'd been doing this job for 6 years. Rose found herself walking over. "I've seen her work," she heard herself saying. "She's one of our best." The look of gratitude in the engineer's eyes said everything. During her flights, Rose began making small changes. When passengers made assumptions about other crew members, she spoke up. When she heard subtle comments about who looked like they belonged in first class, she found ways to challenge those ideas gently but firmly. One day, while organizing the crew room bulletin board, Rose noticed something. Among all the airline's promotional materials, there were very few images showing the true diversity of their staff. She took out her phone and snapped a picture, already forming an idea. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by notes and her laptop. She began writing what would become a proposal for improved training programs. But this wasn't just about diversity seminars. This was about real stories, real experiences, real change. She thought about Captain Lee's weekend classes, about Lynn's daily experiences, about the young engineer's expertise being questioned. Each story became a piece of her proposal, each experience a reason for change. The next morning, she arrived early for her flight and saw a familiar face. The little girl who wanted to be a pilot was back, this time wearing a toy pilot's cap. Her mother was trying to take a photo of her near the gate. "Would you like a picture in front of a real plane?" Rose asked, surprising herself. After checking with the mother, she arranged for a quick photo opportunity near the aircraft window, making sure the wing was visible in the background. "Maybe someday you'll be flying this one," Rose told the beaming child. As she watched them walk away, she pulled out her phone and added another note to her proposal. This wasn't just about fixing past mistakes. It was about building a better future. That evening, after her flight, Rose sat in the crew room staring at her computer screen. Her finger hovered over the send button, her proposal attached and ready to go to airline management. It felt like a small step and a huge leap all at once. 2 weeks after sending her proposal, Rose's phone buzzed with an unexpected email from airline management. Her heart raced as she opened it, expecting a polite rejection. Instead, she found herself reading an invitation to present her ideas at the next staff meeting. "They want me to what?" she whispered to herself, sitting down heavily on her living room couch. The email mentioned that Captain Lee had already agreed to co-present with her. She hadn't even told him about the proposal yet. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Rose spent every free moment gathering stories, statistics, and suggestions. She reached out to crew members she'd spoken with over the past weeks, asking permission to share their experiences. The morning of the presentation arrived too quickly. Rose stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her uniform for the 10th time. "You can do this," she told her reflection, though her hands were shaking. When she arrived at the airline's headquarters, she found Captain Lee waiting in the lobby. "Got your email last week," he said with a warm smile. "Thought you might want some backup in there." The meeting room was packed with airline executives, HR representatives, and senior staff members. Rose saw a few familiar faces, including Lynn and me, who had come to show support. The airline's CEO sat in the front row, checking his watch. Taking a deep breath, Rose began her presentation. She shared what had happened on that flight 2 months ago, not hiding any of her mistakes or assumptions. Then she shared what she'd learned since then, not just from Captain Lee, but from dozens of crew members who trusted her with their stories. "This isn't about pointing fingers," she explained, her voice growing stronger. "It's about opening eyes, including my own." She clicked to the next slide, showing the photo she'd taken of the little girl in the pilot's cap. "When this young lady boards one of our planes 20 years from now as a pilot, what kind of airline do we want her to find?" The question hung in the air as Rose shared her proposals for change. She suggested crew training programs led by people sharing real experiences, not just textbook scenarios. She proposed mentoring programs pairing experienced staff with newcomers from different backgrounds. She even showed mock-ups of new promotional materials reflecting their airline's true diversity. Captain Lee stepped forward then, adding his perspective as both a pilot and an instructor. He shared stories from his weekend classes about young people fighting against assumptions about who would fly planes, fix engines, or lead teams. The CEO leaned forward in his chair, his earlier impatience replaced with genuine interest. Other executives were taking notes. Rose saw heads nodding as she described specific situations and suggested solutions. When she finished speaking, the room was quiet for a moment. Then the questions started, not dismissive ones, but genuine queries about implementation, costs, and timelines. The HR director was already pulling up the airline's training schedule on her tablet. "We could pilot this program next month," she suggested, looking at Rose. "Would you be willing to help develop it?" After the meeting, standing in the hallway surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories and ideas, Rose felt overwhelmed, but in the best possible way. Captain Lee touched her shoulder as he headed out. "Remember what I said about change happening one person at a time," he said with a smile. "Well, sometimes one person can start a wave." Looking around at all the animated conversations happening, Rose realized he was right. What had started as a mistake and an apology was growing into something much bigger. The airline would never be perfect, but it could be better. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. 6 months flew by like a plane with a tailwind. Rose stood backstage at the airline's annual conference, watching hundreds of crew members filling the auditorium seats. Her hands weren't shaking anymore when she gave presentations, but she still felt butterflies in her stomach. "Ready?" Captain Lee asked, adjusting his uniform tie as he joined her behind the curtain. On stage, the CEO was introducing their new training program, which had already run successfully with 5 different groups. The spotlight felt warm as Rose walked onto the stage. Looking out at the sea of faces, she recognized many people who had shared their stories during the past months. There was Lynn, now leading her own crew training sessions. Mai sat near the front, already certified as a mentor for new flight attendants. 6 months ago, I made a mistake, Rose began, her voice clear and steady. I thought it was just my mistake to fix. But what I learned was that real change isn't about one person fixing their own mistakes. It's about all of us working together to build something better. She clicked through slides showing their progress. Over 200 staff members had gone through the new awareness training, 50 mentoring partnerships had been established, and passenger complaints about bias had dropped significantly. But the numbers weren't what made Rose proudest. It was the stories. Like the young maintenance engineer who now confidently led her own team. or the flight attendant who had finally applied for pilot training after years of hesitation. Captain Lee stepped forward to share his part. Last weekend, I had 25 students in my flight class, he said, showing a photo of his diverse group of aspiring pilots. And for the first time, none of them asked if they belonged there. They already knew they did. From the back of the room, Rose spotted a familiar face. The little girl in the pilot's cap, now wearing a proper junior pilot uniform provided by the airline's new outreach program. Her mother had enrolled her in the airline's Youth Aviation Club. Change isn't always comfortable, Rose continued. Sometimes it means looking in the mirror and not liking what we see. But discomfort can lead to growth, and mistakes can lead to opportunities, if we're brave enough to learn from them. She shared a recent photo of a first-class cabin, where passengers of all backgrounds sat comfortably, served by a diverse crew who worked with confidence and pride. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress. This isn't the end of our journey, Rose concluded. It's really just the beginning. Every day brings new challenges and opportunities to do better, to be better. After the presentation, during a reception, crew members kept approaching to share their own stories of change. A young pilot mentioned how senior staff now actively supported her career goals. A ground crew supervisor talked about how the mentoring program had transformed his team's dynamics. Remember that paper airplane your grandfather taught you to make? Rose asked Captain Lee as they watched the interactions around them. He nodded, smiling at the memory. Well, look at what it started, she said, gesturing to the room full of people engaged in animated conversations about their experiences and hopes for the future. Later that evening, as Rose packed up her presentation materials, she found a note left on the podium. It was from the little girl in the pilot uniform. A carefully folded paper airplane with "Thank you" written on the wing. Opening her laptop one last time, Rose added a new slide to next month's training presentation. It showed the paper airplane alongside a quote she'd heard that day. Change isn't about reaching a destination. It's about making the journey better for everyone who follows. As she walked through the terminal heading home, Rose noticed things were different now. Not just because policies had changed, but because people had changed, including herself. And sometimes that's the most important change of all.